They just drew the line. And this time, it's not a bluff. Iran has officially warned the United States that if American military assets are used as launch pads for strikes on Iranian soil, those air bases will be hit, not threatened. Hit. That's a fundamental shift in the language of deterrence, and Washington knows it. Now here's what you need to understand. This isn't Tehran rattling a cage for domestic consumption. This is a calibrated public declaration designed to force Trump into a visible decision, one the entire world is watching. Back down, and American power projection looks hollow. Move forward, and you're potentially igniting a regional war that pulls in Hezbollah remnants, Iraqi militias, Houthi forces, and possibly Russian and Chinese diplomatic cover for Iran simultaneously. Trump is weighing options, but every option carries catastrophic weight. The military-industrial consensus in Washington is pushing for escalation. The financial markets are quietly pricing in oil shocks, and the American people? They're about to find out how much a president's instinct for a deal collides with an empire's instinct for dominance. This is the moment. Pay close attention. So let's actually slow down here and put this in the proper context, because most of what you're hearing in mainstream media is noise dressed up as analysis. They're giving you the what without the why, and the why is everything. Here's where we actually are right now. The United States has been conducting a significant military buildup across the Middle East. 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln already in the Arabian Sea, and the USS Gerald R. Ford moving steadily eastward from the Atlantic, last tracked off the coast of Morocco, now transiting toward the Mediterranean. That's not a routine deployment. You don't move 2 carrier strike groups, each one carrying dozens of warplanes, guided missile destroyers, submarines, toward the same region by accident or just as a diplomatic signal. That is a war posture, and Washington has been briefed that the full military forces needed to carry out a strike on Iran could be in place by mid-March. That gives you a window, a very narrow, very real window, and the clock is ticking. Now, on the Iranian side, their defense minister Aziz Nasirzadeh has made it crystal clear. If the United States attacks, Iran will target American military bases in the region. Not Israeli bases first, not third-party infrastructure, American bases. He wasn't vague about it. He spelled it out in a way that was deliberate and precise. We will not attack neighboring countries. Rather, we will target US bases stationed in them. And that distinction matters enormously because it's Iran essentially saying, we understand where the real power is and we're addressing ourselves directly to it. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi reinforced this same message, confirming that Tehran would strike American assets if conflict broke out. And Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the 86-year-old man who has held together this revolutionary theocracy for decades, has said publicly, directly, that any US attack will spark a regional war, not a bilateral confrontation, a regional war. Now you might be asking yourself, why should I believe these threats are real? Hasn't Iran been making threats for years? And yes, that's a fair question. But here's what's different this time. In June of last year, the United States actually struck Iran. Under Operation Midnight Hammer, B-2 stealth bombers dropped 14 massive bunker-buster bombs on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, America's most powerful conventional weapons, against targets buried deep underground. Trump declared them totally obliterated. And what did Iran do in response? They fired missiles at Al Udeid Airbase in Qatar, a real American base on real American allied soil. 14 missiles were launched, 13 were intercepted. 1 got through and struck a radome. Trump called it a very weak response. And he's right, it was restrained. But understand what just happened there. Iran did strike a US base. That's not hypothetical. That's history that already happened, and it happened just 8 months ago. Since those June strikes, Iran has been doing something fascinating and alarming. It has been rebuilding and rebuilding fast. Missile production facilities that were damaged in the Israeli-American strikes have been reconstructed. Runways at Tabriz Air Base that were cratered by bombs have been restored. Aircraft shelters at Hamadan Airbase have been repaired. And the Shahrud solid propellant missile production facility, Iran's largest, has been swiftly rebuilt. Solid propellant missiles are critical because they don't need time to fuel up before launch. They can be deployed rapidly with minimal warning. That's not a defensive rebuild. That is an offensive reconstitution. And the CIA and Western intelligence agencies know this, they know it, and they're watching it happen in real time through satellite imagery. Secretary of State Marco Rubio acknowledged something striking this week, that there are 30 to 40,000 American troops stationed across 8 or 9 facilities in the region, and that all of them are within range of thousands of Iranian drones and short-range ballistic missiles. Think about that number for a second. 30 to 40,000 American service members, real people, real lives, all sitting within range of a weapon system that Iran has been rebuilding since last summer. And we're seriously considering launching an all-out war against a country that has explicitly promised to target our people. That's the decision sitting on Trump's desk right now. Now, let's talk about the diplomatic track, because it hasn't collapsed. Not yet. And this is where it gets genuinely complicated. There have been indirect nuclear talks between Washington and Tehran, most recently in Geneva, where both sides spent 3.5 hours in conversation. Iran's top diplomat said they agreed on guiding principles. But J.D. Vance came out and said Iran hadn't acknowledged Trump's red lines. So you have two sides that are technically still talking, while both are also actively preparing for war. That's a very dangerous combination. It's the kind of situation where a miscalculation, a misread signal, one rogue actor making a decision, any of that can blow the entire diplomatic track apart in a matter of hours. Trump himself said Thursday that he believes 10 to 15 days is enough time for Iran to reach a deal, while warning of bad things if they don't. 10 to 15 days. That's not a diplomatic timeline, that's a countdown. And Iran knows it. The Iranian government knows it. The regional governments know it. Saudi Arabia's defense minister traveled to Washington specifically to express concerns about a US strike, and not because Saudi Arabia loves Iran. Saudi Arabia is worried about what a war does to regional stability, to oil prices, to their own security. Saudi Arabia reportedly doesn't even want the US using its airspace for strikes. That tells you something profound about the regional consensus, or rather the lack of one, around American military action here. And now let's pull back even further and ask the bigger question, because this is really what this is all about. What is Trump actually trying to accomplish? There are several possible objectives being floated inside Washington's national security circles. One is preventing Iran from reconstituting its nuclear program and eventually building a bomb. Another is regime change, toppling the theocracy altogether. A third, more limited option is a targeted pressure strike to force better concessions at the negotiating table. And a fourth option is simply maintaining the credibility of the threat itself, using the military buildup as leverage to extract a deal without ever firing a shot. These are four very different strategies. They have four very different risk profiles. And from everything coming out of the White House right now, it's not entirely clear which one Trump has settled on, or whether he's settled on any of them. That ambiguity is actually dangerous. When an adversary can't read your intentions with clarity, they have to plan for the worst case. Iran is planning for the worst case. Iranian Defense Minister Nasirzadeh announced last week that Iran successfully tested a missile carrying a 2,000-kilogram warhead. That's nearly 4,500 pounds of explosive force on a single weapon. He didn't specify the model, but the implication was unmistakable. Iran is not just rebuilding. Iran is testing. Iran is demonstrating capability in real time, publicly, while negotiations are still technically ongoing. That's a signal. It's saying, come to the table seriously, or face what we have. And here's what the establishment in Washington doesn't want to say out loud, but what serious analysts know: Iran's ability to hurt the United States is not trivial. Iran has developed, tested, or deployed more than 20 types of ballistic missiles, including systems capable of threatening targets as far away as southern Europe. The Shahed suicide drone, the same one that has proved devastatingly effective in Russia's war in Ukraine, is part of Iran's arsenal too. These are not primitive weapons. These are battle-tested, cost-effective, precision instruments of asymmetric warfare. And Iran has spent nearly half a century specifically designing its military doctrine around the challenge of confronting the United States, not to beat America in a conventional fight, because that's impossible, but to impose costs so severe and so widespread that the price of war becomes unacceptable. That doctrine runs directly through the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow choke point, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest, is the single most important piece of ocean real estate on Earth when it comes to the global energy economy. More than a fifth of the world's traded oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, along with a massive share of liquefied natural gas. Iran has explicitly threatened to close it in the event of an attack. And unlike many Iranian threats, this one has genuine strategic credibility, because Iran sits directly on the strait, has anti-ship missiles positioned along its northern coast, and has practiced exactly these kinds of naval interdiction scenarios in military exercises for years. The last time there was a serious threat to the strait, oil prices spiked globally within hours. A real closure, even a partial one lasting weeks, could send fuel prices to levels that would crush household budgets across America, trigger inflationary shockwaves through already fragile global supply chains, and potentially push the global economy into recession. And that matters for Trump politically, because Donald Trump built his entire domestic political identity around economic performance. He came back to the White House on a promise of prosperity, of bringing down prices, of making America work again financially. A war with Iran that disrupts global oil markets and sends gas prices soaring is a political catastrophe for him at home, regardless of how the military campaign goes. So even from a purely self-interested political calculation, the incentives cut against full-scale war. But here's the problem. Trump has now created a situation where backing down also has costs. He's moved 2 carrier groups, he's set deadlines, his credibility is on the line, and there are people inside the Washington establishment, in the think tanks, in certain corridors of the Pentagon, among the neoconservative foreign policy infrastructure that never really went away, who are actively pushing for military action, who have been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, and who will use every institutional and media lever available to push Trump toward the trigger. Iran's hardline parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Kalibaf, stated that all American bases and forces would be legitimate targets, while lawmakers chanted "Death to America" on the parliament floor. Now look, that kind of rhetoric is partially theater. Every country has its internal political dynamics, and Iran is no exception, but underneath the theater is a real strategic calculation. Iran's leadership genuinely believes that demonstrating resolve, showing that they will strike back, that they have the capability, that they are not afraid, is their only real deterrent against a power that vastly outguns them conventionally. It's the same logic that has driven every smaller country that has faced American military pressure over the past 30 years. Meanwhile, Iran and Russia conducted joint naval drills in the Indian Ocean this week, even as the second American carrier was closing in on the region. Russia. There it is. Because this crisis doesn't exist in a vacuum, it exists inside a much larger geopolitical restructuring that's been underway for years. The fracturing of the post-Cold War unipolar order, the rise of alternative power blocs, the deepening of economic and military cooperation between countries that Washington has sanctioned, pressured, or attacked. Iran and Russia have been building their relationship steadily, and China sits quietly behind both of them, watching, calculating, and benefiting from every dollar of American military spending that gets drawn into another Middle Eastern quagmire. That's the real picture here. Not just a nuclear standoff between Washington and Tehran, not just a question of whether Iran gets the bomb. This is a moment where the decisions made in the next 10 to 15 days will reverberate through the global power structure for a generation. If the United States strikes Iran and it escalates, the entire architecture of the Middle East, the fragile ceasefire in Gaza, the reconstruction process in Lebanon, the normalization conversations between Israel and its neighbors, the oil infrastructure that powers the global economy, all of it comes under threat simultaneously. And if America backs down without a deal, the signal sent to every country watching is that American deterrence has a ceiling, that the threats have limits, that you can outlast the pressure if you hold your nerve long enough. There are no clean options on this table. There never are when you let a crisis build to this point without a coherent, principled diplomatic strategy. What we are watching right now is the consequence of decades of American policy in the Middle East. Sanctions, regime change rhetoric, withdrawal from the nuclear deal in 2018, strikes last summer, all of it converging into this single dangerous high-stakes moment, and the man holding the decision is Donald Trump, a president who genuinely does not want war if he can avoid it, but who is surrounded by institutional forces, political pressures, and his own stated red lines that are all pointing toward the same cliff. Watch this space very carefully. The next 2 weeks are going to tell us a great deal about the future of the Middle East and the future of American power itself.